After my sister trapped me in an ice-cold basement for 18 hours, my mom brushed it off and said, "You're being dramatic, it was just a joke." But when Dr. Greene checked my dangerously low body temperature and reviewed the security footage, she looked at us and said, "This isn't a joke. This is attempted murder." What happened after that changed my life forever. The laughter, thin and crystalline, drifted down from the kitchen above, a cruel, mocking counterpoint to the deep, silent shivers that had taken root in my bones. Each peal of joy, each clink of cutlery, painted a vivid picture of warmth and fellowship I was being deliberately denied. Here, in the unyielding embrace of the concrete, my own breath plumed white, a visible ghost against the dark, a stark testament to a betrayal so profound it would shatter the very foundation of my understanding of family. For 18 agonizing hours I wasn't just freezing, I was being systematically forgotten. And the words that would eventually rip through that comfortable family narrative? They came from a doctor, not my mother. "This," she declared, her voice a low, horrified hum, "is attempted murder." I was Claire Morrison, then 32, and the architect of my near demise was my older sister, Victoria, 3 years my senior. From the earliest whispers of memory, a chasm had stretched between us, widening with every passing year. My mother, Patricia, had always, almost surgically, dissected our perceived attributes. Victoria, the dazzling elder, was bestowed with charm, magnetic beauty, and an effortless ability to captivate any room she entered. I, on the other hand, was assigned the intellect, the academic laurels, the career path that, in the long run, actually anchored something real and tangible. This constant, public comparison wasn't just divisive. It was a slow, deliberate excavation of our sisterly bond, filling the void with resentment and a quiet, simmering animosity. Now, you might think it sounds like hyperbole, a sibling squabble blown out of proportion. But it wasn't. This dynamic, where one child is consistently elevated and the other sidelined, often cultivates what psychologists call a golden child syndrome. The favored child may develop a fragile sense of self-worth tied to external validation, leading to intense sibling rivalry and, in extreme cases, a desperate need to eliminate perceived threats to their position, regardless of the cost. It was Thanksgiving weekend when the true nature of that dynamic unfurled its dark wings. I had journeyed 6 hours from my adopted city of Portland back to Ashland, our childhood hometown. My father, Robert, had been the persistent caller, his voice laced with a longing for reunion, a plea for family connection. Family is important, he'd always insisted, his optimism a shield against the brewing storm. I should have known better than to believe this visit would somehow be different, that the old wounds had magically healed. Victoria, along with her husband Craig and their 3 small children, had arrived 2 days prior, already orchestrating the festivities, cooking lavish meals, and charming everyone into submission. By the time my car pulled into the driveway that Wednesday evening, she had meticulously established herself as the undisputed matriarch, the reigning queen of the household. My mother, Patricia, hovered, fawning over every mundane task Victoria performed, her praise so effusive it was as if Victoria had single-handedly cured a plague, rather than simply baked a pie. The air was thick with a palpable tension, a subtle, unspoken competition I was already losing. The first tremor of trouble struck at Thanksgiving dinner itself. In a moment of sheer oversight, I mentioned my recent promotion, the culmination of years of relentless effort, to senior architect at my firm. The room went silent, a sudden, suffocating vacuum. Victoria's previously radiant smile became brittle, a mask threatening to crack. My mother, with practiced ease, immediately pivoted the conversation, launching into an exaggerated tale of Victoria's selfless volunteer work at her children's school fundraiser. My father, bless his naive heart, attempted to offer his congratulations, but Patricia's voice, deliberately amplified, swiftly drowned out his words, erasing my small moment of triumph as if it had never existed. That was my first mistake, but it wouldn't be my last. The next morning, Friday, Victoria intercepted me in the narrow hallway outside my old bedroom. Her eyes, usually so expressive, were utterly devoid of warmth, cold and calculating as she proposed a trip down to the basement. "Mother wants us to sort through some old photo albums," she explained, a suggestion so seemingly innocent. I hesitated, a flicker of unease, but then I saw my father, Robert, nearby. He chimed in, earnest and hopeful, urging me to spend time with my sister. His lifelong belief in reconciliation, in the inherent goodness of family, had always been his Achilles heel. And so, I descended into the maw of what would become my tomb. Our childhood basement was never meant for living. It was a skeletal space of raw concrete and exposed insulation, with a patch of damp earth towards the back where the foundation had settled unevenly. In the crisp chill of a late November in Oregon, with temperatures already plummeting below freezing after dusk, it transformed into a desolate, unheated vault. It was merely a repository for forgotten relics, Christmas decorations, discarded furniture, shadows. Victoria led the way down the rickety wooden stairs, her voice a cheerful stream of chatter about her youngest daughter's ballet recital. I followed, completely unsuspecting, my mind adrift in the mundane. Near the hulking old furnace, she gestured towards a dusty box of photographs. As I bent to sift through them, a wave of nostalgia washed over me, faded images of birthday parties, sun-drenched summer vacations, awkward school plays. For a fleeting moment, a desperate hope bloomed in my chest. Perhaps, just perhaps, this was a genuine attempt to bridge the canyon between us. Then, the world slammed shut. The resounding thud of the door, followed by the chilling click of a deadbolt. I spun around, heart lurching into my throat, and scrambled up the stairs, throwing my shoulder against the heavy wooden panel. It wouldn't budge. In my descent, I hadn't noticed the deadbolt installed on the outside. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through the fog of disbelief. I began to scream, my voice raw and desperate, pounding on the unyielding wood. From directly above, I heard the faint, retreating cadence of my sister's footsteps, accompanied by a soft, self-satisfied hum. For the first hour, a desperate optimism clung to me. Robert would notice my absence. Patricia would need something from storage. Someone, anyone, would come looking. But the minutes bled into an hour, then two. The cold began its insidious assault, seeping through my thin jeans and sweater, inadequate defenses against the relentless chill. The ancient thermometer on the wall confirmed my growing dread. 34 degrees Fahrenheit. By the fourth hour, my screams had dwindled to ragged gasps, my throat a torn, bleeding mess. My phone, a useless brick, registered no signal. The thick concrete walls and subterranean depth rendered it impotent. I huddled against the furnace, a cold monument that offered warmth only to the floors above, not to the forgotten space below. My jaw ached from the incessant chattering of my teeth. Hour 7 brought a more violent, involuntary shaking. My entire body convulsed, a desperate, futile attempt to conjure heat from nothing. I wrapped my arms tightly around my drawn-up knees, trying to create a tiny pocket of warmth, but the concrete had already leached every calorie from my system. The chilling thought of hypothermia, of succumbing to exposure, began to gnaw at me. Would they even find me? Would anyone truly care? The human mind, when pushed to its absolute limits by trauma and extreme physical duress, can resort to a range of survival mechanisms. Dissociation, where an individual detaches from reality or their own body, and even hallucinations, are often the brain's desperate attempt to protect itself from overwhelming pain and fear. This is not a sign of weakness, but a profound response to an abnormal, life-threatening situation. By hour 10, a strange, disorienting fog began to descend. My thoughts, once frantic, grew hazy and disconnected. The reason for my presence in this frigid tomb began to elude me. Childhood memories fractured and fused with the present, painting bizarre, fragmented tableaus. I saw my grandmother, gone for 15 years, perched in the corner, her voice a comforting murmur, urging me to rest. Just close your eyes, sweetheart. Everything will be better when you wake up. By hour 14, the last ember of hope for rescue had flickered out. No one was coming. Victoria had done this deliberately, with a chilling precision. And Patricia? She either hadn't noticed or simply hadn't cared that I had vanished. My mind drifted to my life in Portland. The apartment overlooking the river, the soft purr of my cat, the organized chaos of my assistant, Lauren, who would undoubtedly worry when I failed to appear on Monday. But Monday felt an eternity away, a distant, unreachable shore. Then, around hour 16, the trembling ceased. My body, exhausted, had simply given up the fight to generate warmth. A strange, almost ethereal peace settled over me, a profound detachment. The biting cold no longer registered as pain. It was just a dull, persistent presence. All I felt was an overwhelming weariness. Sleep, it seemed, was the only logical, welcome conclusion. I allowed my eyelids to drift closed, surrendering. The jarring creak of the door, then a sudden burst of panicked, broken shouting, Robert's voice, calling my name, dragged me back from the precipice. Strong hands lifted my leaden body, carrying me up the long, dark stairs towards blinding, painful light. Sirens, distant at first, then rapidly approaching, wailed a dissonant soundtrack to my rebirth. Someone wrapped me in coarse blankets that felt like sandpaper against my frozen, hypersensitive skin. I awoke in the sterile warmth of Ashland Memorial Hospital, heat lamps strategically positioned around my bed, a clear fluid dripping steadily into my arm. A woman in a crisp white coat stood at the foot of my bed, her brow furrowed in deep concern as she studied a chart. Her name tag read, Dr. Margaret Greene. She noticed my stirring and moved closer, her expression a careful balance of professionalism and a kindness born of witnessing much suffering. After a gentle inquiry about my well-being and a swift check of my vitals, she explained the brutal reality of those 18 hours. Severe hypothermia, a core temperature of 89 degrees Fahrenheit upon arrival. Another hour, maybe 2, she said, and I wouldn't have made it. Then came the question that would unravel everything. How did you end up locked in that basement, Claire? I told her everything. Every minute detail, from Victoria's deceptive invitation to my desperate screams, unanswered. Dr. Greene's face tightened, growing darker with each damning sentence. Excusing herself, she left to make some calls. 20 minutes later, 2 police officers, Detective Sarah Walsh and her partner, Officer Marcus Rodriguez, entered my room. They meticulously recorded my statement, pressing for specifics on the timeline and circumstances. Had there been previous incidents with my sister? Yes, I admitted, a lifetime of subtle cruelty, of psychological games, of systematic undermining. Nothing, however, had escalated to this level of calculated, life-threatening malice. Detective Walsh then inquired about security cameras. My father had installed a system 2 years prior after a neighborhood break-in, covering most of the first floor, including a clear view of the basement door from the kitchen. Could they review that footage? I gave my permission. Robert delivered the footage within hours, his face a ghostly gray, etched with a horror that transcended shock, bordering on unbearable shame. He watched, horrified, as the recording played back Victoria leading me downstairs, then returning alone, calmly securing the deadbolt. He witnessed Patricia casually inquiring about my whereabouts, only for Victoria to smoothly lie. Claire drove back to Portland early, work emergency. He observed, in agonizing detail, his family continuing their day, eating meals, watching television, tucking children into bed, oblivious or perhaps willfully ignorant, while I clawed at the walls of my frozen tomb beneath them. My father wept, a broken man. He had believed Victoria's lie without question, never pausing to wonder why I would leave without a goodbye, without my suitcase, my car still sitting in the driveway. He had trusted his eldest daughter implicitly, and that trust had nearly cost him his youngest. This realization would become the wedge that splintered our family irrevocably. The police arrested Victoria that same evening. She reacted with dramatic protests, tearful declarations of misunderstanding, insisting it was just a prank gone too far. Her lawyer echoed this narrative, claiming she'd merely forgotten I was down there, distracted by her children. But the security footage, cold and irrefutable, obliterated her defense. The camera clearly showed Victoria checking the basement door multiple times throughout the day, ensuring the lock held fast. At one point, a small, satisfied smile had even touched her lips as she tested the deadbolt. Dr. Greene's testimony proved devastatingly crucial, explaining in stark medical detail how perilously close I'd come to death, detailing the permanent damage hypothermia inflicts. Frostbite had claimed 2 of my toes and portions of 3 fingers. I would need intensive physical therapy for years to regain anything resembling full function in my hands. The psychological trauma, she warned, would be a much longer battle, perhaps never fully healing. The attempted murder charge stunned everyone except Dr. Greene, who recognized the cold, deliberate intent reflected in my broken body. My mother, Patricia, promptly emptied her retirement savings to hire a high-priced defense attorney for Victoria. Her call to me in the hospital was not one of concern, but of white-hot rage. "How could you do this to your sister?" she shrieked, ignoring my pain, citing Victoria's 3 children, the disruption to the family. "I was," she claimed, tearing the family apart over an accident. I hung up on her, the line still buzzing with her fury. An hour later, Robert appeared, divorce papers in hand. He had already filed. 37 years of marriage undone by 18 hours of footage. Watching that video, he later confessed, had shattered something fundamental within him, revealing a truth he could no longer afford to ignore. Patricia, he realized, had known, on some deeper level. She had simply chosen not to ask questions, not to investigate, her lifelong favoritism a perverse enabling that had nearly resulted in my death. Within dysfunctional family systems, a powerful phenomenon known as enabling can perpetuate harmful behaviors. This occurs when one family member, often out of a misguided sense of loyalty, fear, or a desire to maintain peace, inadvertently supports or covers up another's destructive actions, preventing accountability and often leading to an escalation of the abusive patterns. The months between Victoria's arrest and the commencement of the trial were a special kind of hell. 6 weeks I endured in the hospital, the physical recovery a torturous climb. The frostbite had been far worse than initial diagnoses suggested. My left foot required surgery to remove the necrotic toes, leaving me unable to walk without assistance for months. Physical therapy sessions were excruciating, designed to force blood back into tissue that had partially died. The nightmares began during this time, waking me with guttural screams, the basement's icy grip tightening around my throat even in sleep. Medication offered little relief, often plunging me into vivid, terrifying hallucinations of freezing to death, while my family stood by, casually debating dinner plans over my frozen corpse. Dr. Greene, ever vigilant, recommended Dr. Helen Yates, a psychiatrist specializing in complex trauma. Dr. Yates became a constant presence, visiting 3 times a week, helping me to understand that what I was experiencing was post-traumatic stress, a normal, terrifying response to an utterly abnormal situation. Someone I had implicitly trusted had tried to end my life, and my brain was struggling desperately to process that seismic betrayal. Recovery, she cautioned, would be a marathon, not a sprint. Some survivors, she added softly, never truly heal from such profound familial violence. Robert, burdened by a visible, gnawing guilt, visited daily, bringing flowers and books, sitting in quiet vigil beside my bed. He had aged 10 years in those 6 weeks, his frame shrinking, his hands developing a nervous, incessant rub. He shared forgotten childhood anecdotes, stories of Victoria's nascent cruelty that he had dismissed as mere sibling rivalry. The pattern, he now realized, had been there all along, a slow, insidious escalation over decades, culminating in a deliberate act of attempted murder. Patricia, however, made only one single visit during my entire hospital stay. She stood rigidly at the foot of my bed, arms crossed, her face a mask of resentment, utterly devoid of concern. She demanded I drop the charges. Victoria, she insisted, was suffering in jail, separated from her children, facing public humiliation. Couldn't I see the damage this was doing to the entire family? The neighbors were whispering, her church friends were asking questions. My stubborn insistence on pressing charges, she declared, was causing far more harm than the actual incident. My disbelief must have been written across my face. The actual incident. That was her dismissive label for 18 hours of deliberate, freezing torture that had nearly stolen my life. She couldn't even bring herself to utter words like attempted murder, assault, or abuse. Everything had to be minimized, sanitized, transformed into something manageable that wouldn't shatter her carefully constructed worldview. A world where Victoria remained the golden child, perpetually beyond reproach. It sounds crazy, but it's how some families operate. Just then, Dr. Greene entered, took one look at the scene, and, with an icily professional fury, ordered my mother to leave. Patricia protested indignantly, asserting her right to visit her own daughter. Dr. Greene's response was a chilling masterpiece of controlled rage. My patient's core temperature was 89 degrees upon admission. Another hour, and we'd be having a very different conversation. If you cannot support her recovery, you need to leave immediately. Patricia, in a huff, stormed out. I never saw her in person again. The media frenzy that followed was overwhelming. Local news outlets first latched onto the story, running segments about the Thanksgiving basement attack. Then regional, then national coverage, turning my personal hell into a public spectacle. My hospital room phone rang incessantly with reporters clamoring for interviews. Hospital security eventually had to station guards outside my door to prevent journalists from sneaking in disguised as medical staff. I granted just one interview, carefully coordinated with the prosecutor's office. A reporter named Jessica Caldwell, from a major network, sat beside my hospital bed, asking gentle, probing questions. I showed her my damaged hands and feet, described the excruciating timeline, the numbing cold. The segment aired nationally, igniting an enormous public interest and debate. Suddenly, everyone had an opinion on the thorny issues of family loyalty versus accountability. The public reaction, predictably, cleaved into two camps. Some insisted I was overreacting, that siblings fight, and this was just an argument that got out of hand. Others recognized the chilling, calculated nature of Victoria's actions, demanding maximum sentencing. The comment sections of news articles became vicious battlegrounds where strangers debated whether I deserved sympathy or condemnation for destroying my sister's life. 3 months after Victoria's arrest, Craig filed for divorce. His public statement, issued through his attorney, expressed a profound horror at his wife's actions and pledged his full support for my recovery and the prosecution. He had hired a private investigator to delve deeper, desperate to comprehend the true nature of the woman he had been married to for 12 years. The investigator unearthed a disturbing pattern of escalating violence in Victoria's past. Incidents at previous jobs I'd known nothing about, like a coworker locked in a supply closet during a dispute, or a neighbor whose car brakes mysteriously failed after a property line argument. Nothing was ever provable, nothing resulted in charges, but the pattern was undeniable. Victoria responded to perceived slights with dangerous, seemingly accidental retaliation. Craig was utterly terrified for his children, haunted by the question of what Victoria might have eventually done to them if this had not happened. The prosecutor assigned to my case was Diana Foster, a veteran of domestic violence cases who possessed an uncanny understanding of family dynamics. She spent countless hours preparing my testimony, anticipating the defense's arguments, coaching me on how to maintain composure under the brutal glare of cross-examination. Diana had seen dozens of cases where family members committed unspeakable violence, only to later claim it was accidental or exaggerated. She also guided me through the complexities of the civil lawsuit process, explaining that while criminal charges would publicly hold Victoria accountable, a civil suit could provide financial compensation for my extensive injuries and ongoing medical expenses. She recommended Jonathan Price, an attorney renowned for personal injury cases involving familial abuse, a man known for his aggressive and strategic approach, exactly what I needed. The preliminary hearings were brutal, each one forcing me to relive the trauma. Victoria's defense attorney, Gerald Hutchinson, was both expensive and ruthless. He relentlessly attempted to reduce the charges to reckless endangerment, arguing that Victoria never intended serious harm. The security footage, of course, demolished that argument, but Hutchinson simply pivoted, trying different angles. Perhaps I had willingly entered the basement and locked myself in. Perhaps I had exaggerated my symptoms for attention. Perhaps this was an elaborate scheme to frame Victoria out of jealousy. I sat in the courtroom, listening to attorneys debate whether my sister had truly tried to kill me or merely made a terrible mistake. Patricia attended every single hearing, sitting behind Victoria's defense table, her gaze burning holes through me, filled with palpable hatred. Robert, on my side of the courtroom, was a ghost, his face gray and haunted, the weight of his belated realizations crushing him. The trial itself finally began 8 months later. During that time, I completely uprooted my life from Oregon. Portland held too many echoes, too many connections to a family I no longer claimed. I accepted a position with an architectural firm in Boston, a comforting 3,000 miles from Ashland. Lauren, my assistant and now my closest friend, helped me pack, made the cross-country drive with me, and stayed for 2 weeks, helping me settle into my new apartment, a sanctuary far from the ghosts of my past. Victoria's attorney deployed every available strategy. Character witnesses, carefully vetted, testified to her impeccable reputation as a mother, her extensive community involvement, arguing this was completely out of character. The prosecution countered with my testimony, bolstered by 3 childhood friends who bravely recounted years of Victoria's casual cruelty towards me. One friend, Amanda, broke down on the stand, her voice choked with decades of suppressed guilt, as she tearfully described Victoria pushing me into a frozen pond when we were 12, then fabricating a story that I'd fallen in while showing off. Craig, Victoria's now ex-husband, had initially believed Victoria's version of events, but the ruthless cross-examination of his wife revealed details even he couldn't rationalize away. The premeditation, he realized with sickening clarity, was undeniable. Victoria had purchased that deadbolt specifically for this purpose, 3 weeks before Thanksgiving, receipts providing irrefutable proof. The jury deliberated for a mere 6 hours. The verdict: guilty of attempted second-degree murder. The judge, citing the extensive planning and the particularly cruel nature of leaving me to freeze to death, sentenced Victoria to 12 years in prison. Patricia collapsed in the courtroom, her screams of injustice echoing through the stunned silence. Robert sat stone-faced in the gallery, his expression utterly unreadable, a man utterly emptied. Craig was awarded full custody of their children, moving them to California and severing all contact with Patricia. Months later, he sent me a letter, a heartfelt apology for his blindness, thanking me for potentially saving his children from whatever dark turn Victoria might have eventually taken with them. His oldest daughter, he wrote, had already begun asking why Aunt Claire never visited anymore. The truth, he knew, would eventually emerge, but he wanted to control that narrative, to protect them. Children, even at very young ages, are incredibly perceptive to the emotional climate of their homes. When exposed to chronic conflict or parental instability, they may internalize the tension, manifest stress through behavioral changes, or even develop what's known as intergenerational trauma, patterns of emotional distress or maladaptive coping mechanisms that can be passed down through families unless consciously broken. The children's therapy records became a crucial part of the civil case. Craig's attorney provided them, with his permission, to demonstrate the full scope of damage Victoria had inflicted. The youngest child, only 4 during the incident, had witnessed fragments of Victoria's unsettling behavior in the days leading up to Thanksgiving. She told her therapist about Mommy being angry at Aunt Claire, about Mommy saying mean things when Claire couldn't hear. The middle child recalled Victoria installing the deadbolt on the basement door, asking why it was needed. Victoria had simply replied, to keep monsters from coming upstairs. Those therapy records gutted me. Victoria had, in her twisted machinations, inadvertently involved her own children, making them unwitting witnesses to her deteriorating mental state. They had sensed something profoundly wrong with their mother, but lacked the framework to comprehend the true danger. Craig's decision to seek full custody wasn't merely protective, it was an act of vital preservation. Who knows what Victoria, in a fit of rage or jealousy, might have eventually done to her own children. Then, the financial investigation revealed an even more disturbing layer of premeditation. Victoria had convinced me to take out a life insurance policy 3 years before the incident, framing it as smart financial planning, as we both approached middle age. During a visit to Ashland, I had, trusting my sister's advice, signed the paperwork. What I hadn't known was that she had submitted a separate beneficiary designation form afterward, forging my signature to name herself instead of the charitable organization I had originally intended. The insurance company, in a staggering procedural oversight, had never sent me confirmation of the beneficiary details, allowing Victoria's deception to remain undetected. $500,000, with herself poised to collect upon my death. Jonathan Price subpoenaed those records and presented them during the civil trial. The jury's reaction was visceral. This wasn't a prank gone wrong, or a momentary lapse in judgment. This was irrefutable proof. Victoria had been planning some form of violence against me for years, setting up a chilling financial incentive for my demise. The basement incident wasn't an impulse. It was the chilling execution of a long-term plan. Diana Foster immediately amended the criminal charges to include attempted murder with premeditation, which carried a much longer potential sentence. Patricia's reaction to the insurance policy revelation was, in its own way, the most telling. There was no shock, no horror that Victoria had forged my signature and meticulously planned my death years in advance. Instead, she blamed me. She blamed me for being successful enough that Victoria felt desperate. If I hadn't gotten that promotion, hadn't moved to Portland, hadn't built a career that made Victoria feel inadequate, none of this would have happened. My very success, she reasoned, had provoked Victoria into extreme actions. Therefore, I was, by her logic, partially responsible for my own attempted murder. Robert filed for divorce the day after the insurance policy came to light. He had, until that moment, clung to a sliver of hope that Victoria had simply made a terrible, impulsive decision. The evidence of years of cold, calculated planning annihilated that hope. He hired the most aggressive divorce attorney in Ashland and fought for every single asset. Patricia, he realized, had enabled Victoria's violence through decades of unchecked favoritism and flimsy excuses. She had, in essence, created a monster, and then unleashed it upon their younger daughter. Robert wanted nothing more to do with either of them. The divorce proceedings were vicious, a final, brutal unraveling. Patricia tried to claim emotional distress, arguing that Robert was abandoning her during the worst time of her life. Robert's attorney countered with a devastating dossier of evidence. Patricia had known about Victoria's disturbing behavior for years, and actively covered it up. Emails surfaced between Patricia and Victoria's former employers. Patricia making excuses for workplace incidents, Patricia offering to pay for damages to avoid official reports. She had been cleaning up Victoria's messes, protecting her golden child, for decades. During this tumultuous period, anonymous letters began arriving at my new apartment in Boston. Hateful screeds blaming me for destroying my family, calling me vindictive and cruel. A handwriting analysis confirmed my chilling suspicion. They were from Patricia, who had somehow obtained my new address. I filed a restraining order against her, too, which only served to intensify her fury. She told people at her church that I had become so spiteful that I had cut off my own mother from contacting me. The restraining order against Patricia proved more challenging to enforce than Victoria's. Patricia never issued direct threats, opting instead for passive-aggressive cards and letters expressing her disappointment in how I'd turned out. But the cumulative effect was harassment, and eventually, a judge agreed. No contact with me, no attempts to obtain my contact information, no third-party messages. Patricia violated it twice, incurring fines and a stern warning that any further transgressions would result in jail time. Amanda's testimony at the trial about the frozen pond incident from our childhood proved pivotal. She had been there, a terrified 12-year-old, watching in horror as Victoria deliberately pushed me through the thin ice into the freezing water. Victoria had stood on the bank, laughing, while Amanda frantically ran for help. When our parents arrived, Victoria, with practiced ease, claimed I had been showing off, skating too close to the weak ice despite warnings. Patricia, predictably, believed her immediately. Robert, though visibly uncertain, had remained silent, unwilling to contradict his wife. Amanda had carried the crushing weight of that guilt for 20 years. She should have told the truth, should have insisted that Victoria pushed me. But she was a child, facing two adults who clearly wanted to believe their eldest daughter. So, she stayed silent, and Victoria, learning she could inflict harm with impunity, continued her cruel trajectory. Amanda wept on the witness stand, her apology to me echoing across the courtroom. Her testimony established a chilling pattern. Victoria's consistent use of cold as a weapon against me, making the basement incident look less like an isolated, impulsive act, and more like the violent escalation of a lifelong abuse. 2 other childhood friends came forward with similar stories. Michael recounted Victoria locking me in a freezer at a friend's house during a birthday party when I was 7, claiming it was a game of hide-and-seek. I'd been trapped for 20 terrifying minutes before another child heard my muffled screams. Rachel described an incident at summer camp where Victoria had deliberately taken my winter coat on the last day, forcing me to ride home in an unheated bus in October weather. The pattern was undeniable and truly, utterly chilling. Patricia never spoke to me again. 6 months after the sentencing, an email arrived, her final, vitriolic message, blaming me for destroying her family. "You are vindictive," she wrote, "cruel. You've always been jealous of Victoria's popularity, her beauty, her perfect family. This is your revenge for a lifetime of being second best." I deleted the message without responding. Robert, however, reached out regularly. We met for coffee whenever my work took me to Oregon, which wasn't often. He had sold the house in Ashland, the memories too potent, moving to a small condo in Portland. Being in that house, he confessed, haunted me. "Every time I walked past the basement door, I heard your screams. Screams I ignored because I believed my daughter's lie." The guilt, raw and consuming, had irrevocably altered him. In Boston, I began therapy with Dr. Raymond Chin, a specialist in trauma recovery. Our sessions focused on the arduous task of rebuilding trust, processing the profound betrayal, and, crucially, understanding that my family's pervasive dysfunction was not my fault, nor my responsibility. It took 2 years before I could consistently sleep through the night without the icy grip of nightmares. 3 years before I could enter a basement without the sudden, suffocating onslaught of panic attacks. The settlement from the civil suit against Victoria offered a measure of justice. My attorney, Jonathan Price, argued compellingly that her actions had resulted in permanent physical disability and profound psychological damage. The jury awarded me $2 million, though collecting it proved difficult given Victoria's lack of substantial assets. Craig, however, agreed to a payment plan from the marital estate, a tangible act of contrition, wanting to make things right in any way he could. I used a portion of that money to establish a foundation for victims of familial abuse. Far too many individuals, I realized, suffer in silence, trapped by societal expectations that insist families must remain together, regardless of the toxicity. My foundation, Second Chances Alliance, provides crucial legal assistance, therapy resources, and emergency housing for those escaping dangerous family situations. In just 4 years, we've helped over 300 people. Dr. Greene, my medical savior, became a close friend and confidant. She attended the foundation's launch, delivering a powerful speech about recognizing the subtle, often overlooked signs of deliberate harm disguised as accidents. Her involvement lent invaluable credibility and media attention. She admitted, with a quiet humility, that she had almost missed the true significance of my case initially, almost accepted the family's glib explanation that I had simply wandered into the basement and gotten trapped. But something about that deadbolt installation had nagged at her, a professional instinct that wouldn't let go. She pushed for the police investigation, even in the face of pressure from hospital administrators worried about offending a prominent local family. 5 years after the trial, I met Daniel. He was a structural engineer, and we collaborated on a major commercial project in Boston. He knew my history. My story had been extensively covered in national news. Attempted murder on Thanksgiving, sister's deadly game. The headlines were sensational, yes, but they also brought much-needed awareness to how often family violence is minimized or entirely overlooked. Daniel never once pressured me to reconcile with Patricia or to forgive Victoria. He possessed an inherent understanding that some betrayals are simply unforgivable, that blood relation does not automatically grant unlimited access to your life. We married 2 years later in a small, intimate ceremony, attended by Robert, Dr. Greene, Lauren, Amanda, and a handful of cherished friends I had cultivated in Boston. The family I had chosen. Not the one I had been born into. Victoria was released from prison after serving 9 years for good behavior. I heard about it through Robert, who, for the sake of his own closure, had maintained minimal, detached contact with her. She had written him letters from prison, never once offering a genuine apology, instead insisting she had been misunderstood. The basement incident, she claimed, was merely a joke gone wrong. She'd meant to let me out after an hour, but had simply gotten distracted. The security footage, showing her meticulously testing the lock throughout the day, became, in her reconstructed narrative, her checking to make sure I couldn't escape and hurt myself in anger. The delusion was complete. She had reimagined herself as the victim of my vindictiveness. Patricia, during her weekly prison visits, diligently reinforced this version of reality, assuring Victoria that I had always been jealous and manipulative. Together, they constructed an entire mythology around my supposed villainy, a desperate attempt to avoid confronting the inconvenient truth that Victoria had deliberately tried to kill me. I didn't attend the parole hearing. My victim impact statement, a stark recounting of how the attack had fundamentally altered my life, stolen my sense of safety, and utterly destroyed my family relationships, was read aloud by the prosecutor. The parole board, citing her clean prison record and completed rehabilitation programs, approved her release anyway. I wasn't surprised. The system, I've learned, often prioritizes the appearance of redemption over the raw, enduring reality of harm done. Robert, knowing Victoria, warned me she might attempt contact. She had, in her letters, made comments about repairing our relationship and explaining what really happened. I filed a restraining order immediately, no contact, direct or indirect. If she came within 500 feet of me, my home, or my workplace, she would be sent straight back to prison for violating the order. She tested it once. 3 months after her release, she appeared at my office building in Boston. Security, recognizing her from the photograph I had provided, immediately called the police before she could even gain entry. She spent 48 hours in jail for the violation. The judge, unequivocal, extended my restraining order to 10 years, warning her that any further contact would result in severe consequences. Patricia called me after that incident, her first direct contact in 6 years. She screamed into the phone, her voice shrill with fury, about how cruel I was being, refusing to let Victoria apologize. I listened in silence for a long, slow 30 seconds, then uttered 4 simple words: "She tried to kill me." Patricia sputtered, insisting I was exaggerating, claiming Victoria had explained everything. I hung up and blocked her number. Robert's health, already fragile, declined rapidly after that. The immense stress of attempting to maintain relationships with both his daughters, while they utterly refused to acknowledge each other's realities, had worn him down to a shadow. 8 months later, he suffered a massive heart attack, dying before the ambulance could arrive. I flew to Oregon for the funeral, my first return in 4 years. Victoria attended, predictably, with Patricia. They sat in the front row, draped in black, playing the role of grieving family members to perfection. I sat in the back with Daniel, surrounded by the true family Robert had built for himself in Portland, the friends who knew his kindness. During the service, Patricia delivered a eulogy, painting Robert as a devoted father who had loved both his daughters equally. Not a single mention of the divorce, or the profound reasons behind it. The burial was worse. Patricia, always the manipulator, insisted that as the eldest daughter, Victoria should help her scatter some of Robert's ashes in his favorite fishing spot. I flatly refused to participate in any ceremony that included Victoria. Robert's lawyer, Timothy Harrison, pulled me aside afterward. My father, he explained, had anticipated this situation. His will divided his estate equally between his daughters, but Victoria's portion was meticulously placed in an irrevocable trust, explicitly for her children, entirely inaccessible to her. My portion came with a letter. I read it that night in my hotel room. Robert's familiar handwriting, shaky from the heart condition that eventually claimed him, covered 3 pages. He apologized, profoundly, for not protecting me, for believing Victoria's lies, for enabling Patricia's corrosive favoritism. He recounted how watching that security footage had irrevocably shattered his entire understanding of his family. He had spent the last years of his life, he wrote, grappling with how he had raised a daughter capable of attempted murder. The letter ended with a plea, a final, poignant request. He wanted me to forgive myself, for surviving, for pressing charges, for refusing reconciliation. None of this, he insisted, was my fault. Victoria had made her choices. Patricia had made hers. I deserved to live without guilt, to build a life filled with people who genuinely loved me. He was, he wrote, intensely proud of the woman I had become, despite everything his family had done to try and break me. I wept for hours that night, Daniel holding me, allowing me to grieve, not just for my father, but for the elusive dream of the family I had never truly had. The fantasy of belonging somewhere, of being unconditionally valued by the people who were supposed to love you most. That dream had died in a freezing basement on Thanksgiving weekend, and I've been mourning its loss ever since. 10 years have passed since that terrifying night in the basement. I'm 42 now, living in Boston with Daniel and our 6-year-old daughter, Emma, who is brilliant and kind. Everything I pray she will always remain. We have built a life here that is full, rich, and anchored in genuine relationships based on mutual respect, not hollow obligation. The Second Chances Alliance Foundation has expanded to 12 cities, actively helping thousands escape toxic family situations. Dr. Greene serves on our board of directors, leveraging her medical expertise to train emergency room staff in recognizing the subtle, often missed signs of familial abuse. Lauren, my unwavering friend, now runs our Boston office, coordinating crucial legal services for victims in need of protection orders or custody arrangements. Victoria is somewhere in Arizona. The last I heard, she had completed her parole and moved away from Oregon, perhaps finally realizing her reputation there was irrevocably tainted. Craig remarried, and his children are thriving. The oldest daughter, now 19, reached out to me last year through social media. She wanted to hear my side of the story, explaining that her father had shared some of it, but she needed to hear it directly from me. We met for coffee in Denver, a neutral city where neither of us carried any history. I showed her the faint scars on my fingers and toes, the permanent, icy etchings of what her mother had done. I told her about the agonizing hours of screaming that went unanswered, the relentless cold that nearly stole my life, the crushing realization that my biological family valued appearances over my very survival. She cried, apologizing for things that were not her fault. She asked if we could stay in touch. We've built a relationship slowly, carefully. She is, thankfully, nothing like Victoria. She's studying social work, driven by a deep desire to help families in crisis. Emma adores her, calling her Cousin Madison. It's a small, precious redemption. This connection forged across generational trauma. We are both consciously choosing to be different from what we came from. Patricia died 2 years ago from complications of diabetes. She had never managed her health properly, and the prolonged stress of Victoria's imprisonment had accelerated her decline. Victoria called to inform me, her first direct contact since the restraining order had expired. Her voice was flat, devoid of emotion. Mother had always hoped we'd reconcile before she died, she said. I replied, that's unfortunate, and ended the call. I didn't attend the funeral. Patricia had made her choices, just as clearly as Victoria had. She chose favoritism over fairness, delusion over truth, enabling over accountability. The consequences of those choices were hers to bear. I had spent enough years fruitlessly attempting to earn love from someone utterly incapable of giving it fairly. The basement incident, in its brutal clarity, taught me a valuable, albeit excruciating, lesson about survival. Sometimes, the people who wound us most deeply are the very ones who were supposed to protect us. Sometimes, families are not nurturing havens, but toxic systems that demand escape, rather than futile attempts at repair. And sometimes, true justice isn't just a prison sentence, it's walking away completely, building something profoundly better from the ashes of what tried to destroy you. I still think about that night occasionally. The paralyzing cold, the suffocating fear, the crushing realization that no one was coming to save me. But I also remember Dr. Greene's quiet determination to uncover the truth, Detective Walsh's unwavering refusal to accept the family's comfortable lies, Robert's eventual, agonizing courage in choosing justice over familial loyalty. Those people, in their own indelible ways, saved my life, and I have tried to honor that by living fully, and by helping others do the same. Emma, our daughter, sometimes asks about her other grandmother, the one we never visit. I tell her the truth, in age-appropriate ways. Some people make bad choices that hurt others, I explain. We don't have to maintain relationships with people who are dangerous, even if they're family. She seems to understand, as much as a 6-year-old can. We are consciously teaching her that she gets to choose who belongs in her life, based entirely on how they treat her. The Foundation's latest project is a documentary, Unseen Wounds, about family violence survivors. My story is featured alongside dozens of others who have escaped dangerous relatives. We're hoping to fundamentally shift the cultural narrative that so stubbornly insists families must stay together, regardless of the inherent toxicity. Blood relation, we argue, does not grant unlimited access to harm another human being. Victoria sent a letter last month. It arrived at the Foundation's main office, forwarded to me with a red flag warning from our security team. I debated reading it for days, the thick envelope a physical manifestation of past pain, before finally tearing it open. 3 pages, in her familiar, looping hand, detailing how prison had changed her, how she had found faith, how she finally understood the enormity of what she had done. She wanted forgiveness, a chance to explain herself, permission to be part of my life again. I burned the letter in our fireplace. Daniel asked if I felt better, and I realized, with a profound sense of peace, that I felt nothing. No anger, no satisfaction, no lingering pain. Victoria had become utterly irrelevant to my life. A cautionary tale I could now share to help others, rather than a bleeding wound that still festered. That realization, in its quiet finality, felt like the ultimate freedom from the family that tried to destroy me. Dr. Greene says recovery isn't linear. Some days, I still struggle with trust, with truly believing people when they say they care about me. Therapy continues, and probably always will. But I have built a life worth living, filled with people who have proven their love through consistent action, rather than empty words. That, I know, is more than I ever had growing up in that house in Ashland. Emma will never spend Thanksgiving in a freezing basement, wondering if anyone cares enough to look for her. She will never question whether her family values her survival. That cycle ends with me. The Foundation, the documentary, the relationships I have painstakingly built, they are all part of ensuring that what happened to me helps prevent it from happening to others. Sometimes, justice is a prison sentence. Sometimes, it's walking away and never looking back. And sometimes, it's building something beautiful from the ashes of what tried to annihilate you. I've done all 3, and I would make the same choices again, without a single moment of hesitation. So, I ask you, in the face of undeniable familial betrayal, does the concept of blood is thicker than water become a moral imperative or a dangerous delusion?